The gray imposing sky over Chicago mirrored the seriousness of the empire I had built, a company inherited from my father and expanded through my own grit. I was 34. The woman I saw in the mirror, the order I had established, the power I wielded, they all filled me with a quiet pride. Everything was in its place. My daughter Lily was at her private school. My husband Mark was at the company presiding over the finance department from his expansive corner office. My life was a perfectly calibrated Swiss watch, precise, relentless, and closed to surprises. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall kept the rhythm of the peaceful silence in our Gold Coast apartment. Our housekeeper was in the kitchen preparing dinner. I was about to return to my files when the doorbell chimed. An unexpected visitor at this hour was a discordant note in my flawless composition. A moment later, our housekeeper entered the living room, an uncharacteristically nervous expression on her face. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, hesitating. "There's an elderly woman at the door. She says her name is Helen. She looks very ill. She can barely stand. She says she won't leave without speaking to you. What should I do?" I frowned. I never saw anyone without an appointment, but the worry in her voice piqued my curiosity. I placed the file on the coffee table and stood, smoothing the silk robe I was wearing as I walked to the door. The woman standing in the hallway did not belong in my world. Her coat was old, its color faded, but it was the look on her face that stopped me. A face etched with deep lines, pale as chalk. The skin under her eyes was sunken, her lips tinged with blue. I could hear the rasp in her chest as she breathed. One hand was braced against the doorframe supporting her weight. "Are you Evelyn Hayes?" she asked, her voice as weak and rustling as dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I am," I said, my tone distant. "How can I help you?" The woman tried to take a deep breath, but it was cut short by a hacking cough. "My name is Helen," she managed to say. "I don't have much time, child. Please let me in. There's a burden I must pass on to you. A truth I have to tell before I die." The phrase "before I die" and the sharp determination in her eyes gave me pause. This was no beggar. Her eyes held the heaviest weight a person could carry, regret and necessity. I stepped aside. "Please," I said. "Come into the living room." Helen walked in with slow, painful steps. She perched on the edge of a velvet armchair as if she knew she didn't belong there. I offered her water, but she refused with a wave of her hand. "Nothing goes down anymore," she said. Her eyes were fixed on the pattern of the oriental rug. Her hands clutched the purse in her lap. Then she lifted her head and looked directly into my eyes. "I have a daughter," she began. "Her name is Brenda. She's 35. She has wasted her youth, her life waiting." I listened in silence, trying to understand what this had to do with me. But a nameless anxiety was growing inside me. "My daughter has been in love with a man for years," Helen said, her voice hardening slightly. "A married man. He always lied to her." "I don't love my wife," he said. "I'm going to get a divorce. I'm just waiting for things at work to settle down." "For 9 years, Mrs. Hayes, 9 long years." "That's very sad," I said with cool politeness. "But why are you telling me this?" Helen leaned forward, her eyes welling up. "I'm sick, child. The doctors say I have days left. If I die, who will look after my grandchildren? Their father or my daughter who still believes his lies?" "Your grandchildren?" I asked, unable to stop my voice from trembling. "She has children with this man." "2 of them," Helen said, raising 2 fingers on her right hand like a witness in court. "A boy Ben, he's 6, and a girl Isla, she's 4. They hug their father's neck when he comes over. But when evening comes, that man goes back to his own house, to his own wife." My stomach clenched. I felt my hands turn to ice. Why was a stranger's life story making me so tense? Why was I finding it hard to breathe? Helen, I said, trying to make my voice firm. What does any of this have to do with me? Who is this man? The old woman let out a long sigh. She opened her purse, her hand trembling as she searched for something inside. The pity in her eyes scared me more than anything. For a stranger to pity me shook the foundations of the power I had built. That man, she said in a whisper. But in the empty living room, the whisper echoed like a scream. That man is your husband, Mark. The world stopped. The ticking of the clock fell silent. The hum of the city outside my window disappeared. All that remained was a high-pitched ringing in my ears. Lies, I said. The voice didn't even sound like my own. Mark would never do that. We've been married for 10 years. We have a daughter. We run the company together. Helen shook her head. I wish it were a lie, she said. I wish I were just a senile old woman, but this is the truth. Mark has been with my daughter for 9 years. He was at the hospital when Ben was born. He was there when Isla took her first steps. The nights he says he's working late, the times he says he has an out-of-town conference. Those are the times he's at our house eating at my table. Mark's late nights at the office, his sudden business trips out of Chicago, those hours when his phone was off during important meetings, they all started to click together in my mind like pieces of a monstrous puzzle. But no, it couldn't be. Mark or my reliable, calm Mark. My Mark. Get out, I said, jumping to my feet, my legs trembling. Get out of my house. You're slandering him. Helen struggled to her feet as well. She offered no defense. She simply reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph. She placed it on the coffee table right in front of me. Look, she said in a tired voice. Just look. I've done my duty. Now I can die with a clear conscience. The rest is up to you. My eyes fell to the photograph on the table. I didn't want to look, but it was impossible not to. It was Mark. He was wearing the custom-made blue shirt I had given him for his birthday last year. He was sitting on the grass in a park. On his lap was a curly-haired little boy, and next to him, a blonde woman looking at him with adoration, holding a little girl. And Mark was smiling. He was smiling with a genuine, relaxed joy I had never seen at company galas or serious board meetings. He was smiling in a way he never smiled with me. The photograph settled in my gut with the cold, sharp reality of truth. As Helen walked slowly to the door, I was frozen to the spot. Those children know their father, she said just before she left. But their father is hiding them. When the door closed, I was utterly alone in my vast living room. The power I held, the prestige I trusted, my father's legacy, the company, it all suddenly lost its meaning. I sank to my knees. The face of my smiling husband in the picture stared back at me. 9 years, 2 children, and I had lived inside this colossal lie for years without noticing a thing. The tears hadn't come yet. Shock was faster than pain. But the fortress of trust inside me had crumbled, leaving behind a profound darkness. What was I going to do now? Tear up this photo and go on with my life, or would I demand an accounting for this betrayal? My trembling fingers picked up the photograph. I looked at Mark's smile, and in that moment, something inside me changed forever. The photograph in my hand wasn't just a frozen moment in time. It was a bucket of ice water dumped over the 10 years of my labor over the magnificent life I had built with my own 2 hands. I was sitting on the expensive hand-woven rug in the middle of the living room, the strength gone from my knees. My eyes flickered between the mark in the photo and the image in my mind of my flawless business partner. When my father handed me this company, there were whispers that a woman couldn't survive in the Shark Tank of Chicago real estate. She can't do it, they said. She'll crumble under the weight. But I silenced those whispers with the rustle of signed contracts and the roar of cranes reshaping the city's skyline. I left the house before sunrise, the click of my heels echoing in the corridors of City Hall. I hadn't just taken over a business. I had made it grow, leaving my signature on the city itself. Mark was the most solid, most secure corner of this picture. As the company's CFO, he held the keys to our treasury. While I was in the field setting strategy and battling zoning boards, he stayed behind managing the numbers, holding those endless meetings with the banks. Whenever I felt my shoulders slump with exhaustion, I'd go to his office on the top floor. He would always tell me in that calm, controlled voice, "You're on the front lines, Evelyn. I'm holding the fort." It turns out the walls of that fort were made of sand, ready to collapse at the first wave. The same perfect order reigned in our home. When our daughter Lily came down for breakfast, Mark would fold his newspaper and give her his full attention. At our famous Sunday brunches, he'd put fruit on Lily's plate and brief me on the week's schedule. To outsiders, we had an enviable life. Mark would sit in the front row at Lily's piano recital, his eyes shining as he applauded. The ideal father, the ideal husband, the ideal executive. But now Helen's raspy voice echoed in my mind, shattering this perfect picture. "While you thought he was working late," the old woman had said, averting her eyes, "he was warming himself by the space heater in our apartment." A memory surfaced, last winter during the year-end closing. The balance sheets aren't adding up. Audit's coming up. "I'll be at the office all night," Mark had said. When I offered to have a hot meal sent over, he refused. It turned out that night he was in Helen's cramped apartment, sitting cross-legged on the floor. While our central heating kicked in at the slightest chill, he was in a place with a hissing radiator. "My son-in-law loves my lasagna," Helen had said as if we were having a normal family chat. "He won't eat it at your house. Says Evelyn doesn't know. Says it gives him heartburn, but he'll eat pans of it when I make it." My stomach turned. It was true. Whenever our housekeeper made lasagna, Mark would politely push his plate aside. "It's too rich, honey," he'd say. It wasn't his stomach that found it heavy. It was his conscience. Or perhaps he was already full from eating it at that other house. Another image stabbed at my brain. The spring day Lily won an award at school. Mark was beside me, yes, but he was constantly checking his phone, shifting restlessly, waiting on an important wire transfer, he'd said. Helen's whisper was in my ear. My little granddaughter Isla took her first steps that day. We thought her father was with us, but he suddenly had to leave. He came to your ceremony. When he returned to them that evening, he held his daughter for hours as if trying to make up for the moment he had missed. Mark had two faces. One was the serious, distant CFO in Italian-cut suits who stood by my side. The other was the man in the photograph sitting on the grass in an old t-shirt hugging his children, the man who fixed the leaky faucet in Brenda's apartment and carried in the groceries. My Lily knew her father as a powerful businessman. For any repair at our home, we called a professional. Mark wouldn't even pick up a screwdriver. But according to Helen, if the doorknob breaks, Mark fixes it. If the roof leaks, Mark climbs up. I looked at the photo again. Mark's relaxed, unmasked smile was an expression I had never seen on his face behind that massive mahogany desk at the office. In the empire he built with me, he might have been a king, but in that small apartment at that humble table, he was experiencing the simple lightness of being just a father. And I, one of Chicago's shrewdest businesswomen, had been watching this play from the front row for 9 years. I, who knew every cent, every comma in the company's accounts, had failed to notice this enormous fortune, these years stolen from my own life. My CFO had defrauded me not just of money, but of my life. With trembling fingers, I placed the photograph on the coffee table, right next to the thick manila envelope. When Helen left, she hadn't just left a picture. She had taken this envelope from her purse and placed it under the photo where it sat like a heavy secret. My eyes were swollen, my throat tight, but the businesswoman inside me whispered that this envelope held something far more than emotional devastation. I picked it up. It was heavy. I emptied its contents onto the glass surface of the table. What spilled out were not love letters or romantic notes. They were documents that spoke my language: numbers, signatures, bank statements, and official papers. I picked up the top sheet. It was a photocopy of articles of incorporation from the Secretary of State. The date was 6 years ago. A company named Apex Consulting and Logistics had been formed. The founder was a name I'd never seen, but my eyes were drawn to the signature card below. Full financial authority for the company had been granted via a sweeping power of attorney to one person, Mark. My breath caught in my throat. I frantically shuffled through the other papers. They were bank account statements, regular wire transfers from our company, my father's legacy, to this shell corporation. In the memo, lines were vague, innocuous phrases that wouldn't raise flags during an audit: consulting services, third-party vendor payment, market research. I looked at the amounts: 10,000, 30,000, 50,000. As the dates progressed, the sums grew larger. I held one up to the light. The signature authorizing the transfer was Mark's. My CFO, my husband, my life partner. Every month, he had been siphoning off money from the contracts I signed, from the sweat of the workers on my construction sites, drop by drop into his own private pool for his other family. Lightning struck in my mind. I remembered the cash flow crunch we had last year. Mark had stood before me with a worried expression. "The market's really tight, Evelyn. Collections are slow. We're going to have to tighten our belts." During that time, I cut my personal spending, even postponed buying new furniture for our apartment. While I was struggling to keep the company afloat, he was emptying its coffers. That tight market was a lie. A cover story for the well-being of Brenda and her children. Among the documents, a copy of a property deed caught my eye. A condo in a luxury building in Lincoln Park. The deed was in the name of the shell company. The closing date was just 2 weeks after we had paid Lily's tuition for the year. He had bought a warm, safe home for that woman and her children with our money, with the power of my company. I put my head in my hands. This wasn't just an affair. This was a planned, systematic financial crime. Mark hadn't just stolen my bed and my trust. He had stolen my work, my labor. He had betrayed my father's legacy. In that instant, the heartbroken crying woman inside me went silent. My tears stopped abruptly. As the last tear dried on the rug, I felt the blood in my veins run cold. The heavy stone on my chest lifted, replaced by a shield of ice. I stood up. I was no longer trembling. I gathered the scattered papers from the table with meticulous care, arranging the statements by date, placing the incorporation document on top. I put them all back in the manila envelope. This was no longer a marital crisis. This was a corporate matter, and I was my father's daughter. I had no right to be an emotional wreck. I was facing a professional con artist who had played me for a fool and embezzled from my company. And I would give him the answer he deserved, not by smashing plates in the kitchen, but in the language he understood, with documents and strategy. I took the envelope and walked to my home office. I keyed in the code to the heavy steel safe. I opened the door and placed the envelope in the very back in a corner where no one, especially Mark, would ever find it. The metallic click as I closed the safe door was the sound of the beginning of the end for Mark. I looked at myself in the living room mirror. My face was pale, but the expression in my eyes had changed. There was no longer love or disappointment in that gaze. There was only sharp, unyielding resolve. When Mark came home that evening, he would find his clueless, trusting wife. He would continue to play his game, but from now on, I was writing the script. Before the dawn broke, before the city's hazy grayness had lifted, I was at the office tower. My voice didn't tremble as I told the night guard I had an early international conference call. As the elevator ascended silently to the 40th floor, I looked at my reflection in the mirrored walls. The circles under my eyes were dark from lack of sleep, but the wounded woman was gone. In her place was a warrior sworn to protect her father's legacy. I closed the heavy door to my office and didn't turn on the overhead lights. Only the yellow glow of my desk lamp illuminated the room. I sat down at my computer. I typed in the master administrator password that even the head of IT didn't know, a password my father had taught me years ago just in case. The screen glowed with blue light. I could now see the system's X-ray. The papers Helen brought were just a thread. Now I would pull that thread and see how big the tangle was. I delved into the depths of the accounting software. In the search bar, I typed the letters Apex. The list that appeared on my screen took my breath away. Hundreds of transactions stretching back not just a few years but further. Consulting services, logistical support fees, market research advance, all hidden under perfectly corporate, unsuspicious headings. But when I clicked into the details, the truth was stark and undeniable. I opened one invoice. The date was July of last year. Those suffocating days when our cash flow was strangled. When I was scrambling to secure a line of credit to make payroll. That month, Mark had made a massive transfer to the Apex Consulting account. The memo line read, "Emergency fund transfer." What emergency? Probably Brenda's rent or the kids' summer camp fees. The hand holding the mouse trembled, but I didn't stop. I opened every single invoice, every single statement. I copied them all to an encrypted external hard drive. Mark thought he had erased the paper trail, but every step he took in the digital world left an indelible footprint. He had been siphoning money from the company's veins, and all the while he had smiled at me and said, "Be patient, Evelyn. We'll get through this." It turned out we weren't the ones who needed to get through it. He had already launched his own lifeboat. As 8 a.m. approached, I heard the sound of heels in the hallway, assistant cleaning staff. I quickly closed the screen, slipped the hard drive into my purse, and opened a random project file. My door opened without a knock with that familiar self-assurance. It was Mark. "Morning, honey," he said cheerfully, holding 2 cups of coffee. The scent of his expensive cologne, which once brought me comfort, now made me nauseous. "You're in early. Figured I'd find you here when you weren't at home." He approached my desk and set a coffee in front of me. His navy suit was impeccable, his tie perfectly knotted. His face had the infuriating calm of a man with a clear conscience. "Good morning," I said, closing the file. He didn't even notice the icy tone in my voice. "Had some work to catch up on." Mark perched on the edge of my desk right next to the computer where I had just documented his theft. "You're working yourself too hard, Evelyn," he said in a caring tone, reaching out to touch my shoulder. The contact felt like a burn, but I didn't pull away. "Let me handle these details. The financials are my job. You just focus on the big picture." "Of course, you'll handle it," I said, my eyes locked on his. "You're very good at making everything look right, Mark." He smiled, thinking it was a compliment. Just then, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He reached for it, and his expression shifted for a fraction of a second. The professional mask slipped, replaced by a softer, more private, slightly guilty look. "Sorry, honey." "Important supplier," he said, but he was lying. When he spoke to suppliers, his brow furrowed and his voice became firm. Now, his eyes were soft. He didn't leave the room. He walked toward the window, turning his back to me. He answered the phone. His voice was low, but every word was clear in the office's silence. "Okay," he whispered. "I know it's hard. Just a little longer. Be patient. I'm arranging everything. I promise it will be worth the wait." His back was to me, but from the slump of his shoulders, the placating softness in his tone, I could feel the desperation of the woman on the other end of the line. Brenda had probably called him, maybe about a problem with the kids or to ask when he would finally be hers completely. And Mark was selling her hope again. "Just a little longer," he said. A little longer until what? Until he had completely bled me dry. Until he had hollowed out the company and could escape to the new life he had built. Everything is going according to plan, Mark said into the phone, his voice even lower. Just a little more time. He hung up and turned back to me. I watched with a mixture of awe and disgust as he changed his expression in that single second, putting on the mask of the faithful husband and reliable partner. Problem with a shipment, he said with a shrug. But I handled it. I'm sure you did, I said again. Your plans always work out perfectly. Mark took a sip of his coffee. Well, I'm heading to my office. Checks to sign, he said, walking to the door. I watched him leave, whistling. He thought everything was under his control. He was placating Brenda with patience and me with trust, but he didn't know that the hard drive in my purse was the point of no return, and the process of using that evidence was now in my hands. I placed the external hard drive on the desk in front of Arthur, nestled between stacks of files. We were in the quiet, insulated office of my father's most trusted CPA, a man whose hair had turned gray in this profession. The late afternoon sun filtering through the window-illuminated dust motes in the air. But the atmosphere in the room was as heavy as lead. I need you to look at this, Arthur, I said, maintaining the icy tone in my voice. Just look and tell me I'm wrong, that I'm being paranoid. Arthur pushed his thick-rimmed glasses down his nose and plugged the drive into his computer. The silence was broken only by the clicking of keys and his occasional deep, troubled breaths. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I sat on the edge of my chair, hands clasped in my lap, not like a defendant awaiting a verdict, but like a judge preparing to deliver one. Finally, Arthur leaned back. His face was ashen. He took off his glasses, set them on the desk, and rubbed his face with a trembling hand. Evelyn, he said, his voice cracking. What I'm seeing here, this isn't just an irregularity, my dear. This is a fundamental attack on the company's foundation. How much? I asked. I needed to know the number, to hear the price of his betrayal down to the last cent. Far more than you can imagine, he said, turning back to the screen and pointing to a chart. It's not just the cash transfers. It's tax evasion, fraudulent invoicing, embezzlement. Mark funneled nearly 30 of the company's liquid assets into this shell corporation. But there's worse. What could be worse? Arthur looked at me with pity in his eyes. There are documents he forged with your signature, Evelyn. On some of the board resolutions, especially for high-risk debt instruments. It's your name. I checked the dates. On those days, you were either at an international trade show or on vacation with Lily. This man planned everything. He wasn't just lining his pockets. He was building an escape plan that would pin the crime on you, that would send you to prison. That sentence obliterated the last shred of mercy within me. That naive voice, whispering, maybe there's an explanation, died. Mark hadn't just deceived me. He had been willing to throw Lily's mother, the guardian of his father's legacy, and my own freedom, into the fire. He was ready to offer me up as a sacrificial lamb to secure the future of that woman, Brenda, and their children. I stood up. The trembling in my legs from that morning was gone, replaced by a cold fury that flowed through my veins, holding me ramrod straight. But it was a calm, unshakable resolve focused on the outcome. This wasn't about getting even. This was about the quiet, clean execution of justice. What do we do? Arthur asked, his worry palpable. Do we go to the police? No, I said, my tone absolute. If we go to the police now, Mark will turn this into a domestic dispute. My wife is having a jealous breakdown. She's making false accusations. He'll drag it out, destroy evidence, move the money offshore. We have to catch him off guard, defenseless. I took my phone from my purse and called the company's senior counsel, James Miller. James, I said when he answered, my voice so flat and emotionless it sounded like I was discussing the weather. There's an emergency. I'm at Arthur's office. I need you here immediately. And bring all the draft documents required to terminate a board member for gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. Also the paperwork to get a temporary restraining order on all company accounts. I brushed off James' confused questions with short answers and hung up. I walked to the window. Outside, Chicago's evening rush hour had begun. The red taillights felt like a warning of the end that was approaching for Mark. "What's your plan, Evelyn?" Arthur asked, the worry in his eyes giving way to respect. I turned back to the table and looked at the printouts of the criminal evidence. I picked up a red pen and drew a hard line through a line item with my forged signature. "The plan is this," I said, formulating each word like a chess move in my mind. "Mark will suspect nothing. I'm going to tell him we've landed a massive investment opportunity, a foreign partnership that will change the future of the company. I'll call for an extraordinary board meeting, telling him the new stakeholders and their lawyers will be there. He will think this meeting is to grant him more power, maybe even to give him half the company. He will walk into that room like a king drunk on his own triumph." Arthur took a deep breath. "And then?" "And then," I finished, narrowing my eyes, "when he walks through that door, he won't be met by his adoring wife. He'll be met by me acting as prosecutor with all the evidence in hand. There won't be champagne on the table. There will be these documents and police reports. He will have nowhere to run. I will take his reputation, his money, the fake paradise he built, all of it in a single move. This isn't a divorce, Arthur. This is a corporate cleansing." As I left the office, I was no longer a woman in mourning. I was preparing to execute a decision, and there was no turning back. When Mark came home that night, I would smile at him, serve his dinner, and ask, "How was your day, honey?" While he lied to me, I would be counting down the days. His last day was coming, and as he fell into the pit he had dug for himself, I would simply watch. The heavy oak door of the boardroom was closed, but the tension inside seemed to seep through the walls. I sat at the head of the table in the leather chair my father had occupied for years. To my right was our corporate attorney, James Miller. To my left, our CPA, Arthur. Across from them sat the other two members of our board. No one spoke. The only sounds were the low hum of the ventilation and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. In the center of the table lay the thick black binder that held Mark's downfall. My hands were clenched under the table, digging into my palms, but my face was a mask devoid of any emotion. The woman inside me wanted to scream, to cry. The chairwoman on the outside was a statue of ice. The door opened. Mark walked in. He wore that familiar, infuriatingly confident smile. His walk had an "I've got this" air. He buttoned his jacket, glanced around, and took in the crowd, assuming this gathering was not a trap I had set, but an appreciation of his success. "Hello everyone," he said cheerfully. "Didn't expect such a full house. Evelyn, where are the foreign investors you mentioned? Or is it a surprise?" He pulled out a chair and sat directly across from me, looking into my eyes like a child seeking approval. A strange burning pain shot through my chest at the thought of extinguishing the light in those eyes. "There are no investors, Mark," I said. My voice was so flat and cold that the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mark's smile froze. "What do you mean? You said on the phone it was a huge opportunity." "The opportunity is over," I cut in. "This is a reckoning." I reached out and pushed the black binder forcefully across the table toward him. It slid across the smooth surface and stopped right in front of him. "Open it," I commanded. Mark looked from me to James and finally to Arthur, who was staring down at the table, unable to meet his gaze. He had finally sensed the tension. With a slight tremble in his hands, he lifted the cover of the binder. On top were the incorporation documents for Apex Consulting and a detailed breakdown of the money transfers. His eyes scanned the pages. The color drained from his face second by second. The vibrant, energetic, confident man was gone, replaced by a gray, aged, terrified mask. His lips were dry. "What? What is this?" he stammered, his voice no longer booming. "That is your criminal file, Mark," I said, never taking my eyes off him. "It's the record of the millions you siphoned from the company's accounts into your own shell corporation. The fake invoices, the fraudulent expenses, and most importantly," I picked up another paper from the table and held it up, "the loan agreements you forged with my signature." Mark shot to his feet, knocking his chair over with a loud crash that echoed in the room. "Evelyn, this is absurd. This is all a misunderstanding. I can explain. That company, that was a structure I set up for our own discrete investments for tax advantages." "That's not true," I said, the control in my voice cracking for the first time. But I quickly recovered. I leaned across the table. "That company is for your other family, Mark. For Brenda and for your children." Mark's jaw dropped. Hearing Brenda's name was the final blow. Pure terror appeared in his eyes. There was no room left for denial, for excuses, for lies. His entire defense mechanism had crumbled. You know," he whispered. "I know everything," I said. "The 9 years, the 2 children, the house you bought them with my money, the fake paradise you built with my work, with my father's legacy. I know it all." Mark gripped the table as if he couldn't stand on his own. He tried to take a step toward me. "Evelyn, listen to me. I swear I love you. She was just a mistake. I couldn't get out of it. The money, I was going to put it back. I swear I was going to pay back every penny." James, the attorney, intervened, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Mr. Hayes, as of this moment, all your signing authority with the company has been revoked. We have filed a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office against you for charges of aggravated fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty, and this is your notice of termination." James slid a paper in front of Mark. Mark didn't even look at it. His eyes were fixed on me, pleading. "Evelyn, don't," he begged. "Are you going to send me to prison? Are you going to send Lily's father to prison? How will you explain this to our daughter?" That sentence fueled the fire inside me. His attempt to use Lily was the final proof of his cowardice. Lily's father was supposed to be the man who protected this company and his family, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You are not that man. What you did is a crime, Mark. And now you will walk out that door you love so much. Security will escort you downstairs. You will not even be allowed to collect your personal belongings." Mark looked around. Arthur kept his head down. The other board members looked at him with disgust. There was no escape. His shoulders slumped. The proud CFO suddenly shrank, withered, and disappeared. "You can't do this," he said in a weak voice. But even he didn't believe it. "I already have," I said. Without another word, he turned and shuffled toward the door. Just as he was about to exit, he stopped and looked back at me one last time. Was there remorse in that look or the anger of being caught? I couldn't tell. When the door closed behind him, the silence returned. "Congratulations, Miss Hayes," James said quietly. "You did the right thing." I nodded. From the outside, I was a victorious, powerful businesswoman. I had saved my company and fired the traitor. But under the table, where no one could see, my hands were still shaking violently. Somewhere inside me, the funeral for my husband of 10 years, for my youth, for my dreams, was taking place. Justice had been served, but it hurt far more than I had ever imagined. Just 2 hours after Mark was escorted from the building by security, red and blue lights flashed against the pavement in front of the skyscraper. From the window of my 40th floor office, I watched the crowd, small as ants, below. On the gray Chicago asphalt, the door of an unmarked police car opened. The man whose arm I once took to attend galas, the father of my child, was led to the vehicle by two plainclothes officers, his hands cuffed in front of him. He didn't look up. The proud, self-assured Mark was gone, replaced by a slumped shadow. The car door slammed shut and they drove away silently without sirens. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I wasn't crying. My tear ducts felt dry. There was only a profound exhaustion and a strange sense of relief. Our lawyer, James, entered the room as dusk was settling. He had taken off his jacket and loosened his tie, the weariness of a long battle on his face. "The judge issued the arrest warrant," he said. "The evidence is overwhelming. He's been denied bail due to flight risk and the possibility of evidence tampering. He'll be transferred to Cook County Jail tonight." Cook County, I repeated. Cold walls, iron bars. Mark was a man of fine dining and plush armchairs. I couldn't imagine him surviving even one night there, but I felt no pity. He had made that choice the day he forged my signature, the moment he set up that shell company. We filed for a gag order, but Chicago is a small town in some ways, James continued. The rumors are already starting to fly. Your phone is going to be ringing off the hook. The banks, the suppliers, everyone's going to panic. He was right. The Chicago business world was merciless. The moment they saw someone stumble, they circled like sharks. My phone on the desk was vibrating incessantly. I picked it up and turned it off. "No panic, James," I said. "The ship isn't sinking. We've just thrown the dead weight overboard. By tomorrow morning, everyone will understand that." The next morning, I gathered all the employees in the main conference hall. There were whispers, anxious glances, huddles in corners. When I walked in, they all fell silent. I was wearing a simple black power suit. My makeup was minimal, but I stood taller than ever. I walked up to the podium. "Everyone," I began, my voice clear and strong, echoing through the hall. "Some of what you have heard is true. A serious breach of trust and a financial crime were discovered within our company. The person who committed this crime was unfortunately our former CFO, Mr. Mark Hayes. We have parted ways with him and the legal process has begun." A murmur went through the crowd, but I raised a hand to silence them. I scanned their faces. A young woman in accounting had tears in her eyes. The veteran mailroom clerk was wringing his hands anxiously. I had to give them confidence. However, I continued, raising my voice, "This company does not depend on individuals. This company stands on the vision of my father, my hard work, and your sweat. A hole was torn in our finances. Yes, but we have patched that hole. We are not abandoning ship. Your paychecks will be deposited on time. Our projects will not be delayed. I will not allow anyone's livelihood to be threatened. Are you with me?" There was a brief, tense silence, then from the very back, a faint clap, then another and another. The applause was a vote of confidence. In that moment, I felt that in their eyes, I was no longer the cheated, victimized wife, but the boss who was managing a crisis. From that day on, my life changed completely. After dropping Lily at school, I would come to the office and work until midnight. Arthur and I dove into the deepest corners of the accounts, tracing every hole Mark had dug, every penny he had stolen. The hardest part was the meetings with the banks. I could see that this woman can't handle it look in the eyes of the serious gray-suited bankers across the table. But I didn't back down. I laid my files out before them. "I am here," I told each one. "I haven't run away. I stand behind our debts. Give me time and I will pay you back every single cent. But if you turn off the taps now, we all lose." The determination in my voice, the business genes I inherited from my father, worked. They backed off, extended deadlines, and agreed to restructuring plans. In the evenings when the office was empty, I would sometimes look at the stacks of files on my desk and shudder. I was alone. There was no husband at home waiting for me, no one to share my day with. But this loneliness wasn't frightening anymore. I had met my own strength. I was not just a wife or a mother. I was a fighter. One evening, working at my desk, I looked out at the lights of Chicago. The city was the same, but I had changed. Mark was in jail paying his price. I was out here rebuilding my freedom and my reputation with my own two hands. I was tired, yes, but my head was held high, and that was worth everything. The insistent ringing of my phone cut through the silence of the stacked files on my desk like a knife. It was an unfamiliar landline number. Normally, I wouldn't answer, but a gut feeling told me this wasn't a telemarketer. "Is this Evelyn Hayes?" A formal, distant voice asked. "We're calling from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. A patient named Helen Miller was brought into our ER. Her condition is critical. We found your business card in an old wallet in her purse." It was the only contact number. "I'm on my way," I said without a second thought. I grabbed my coat and bolted as if I had been looking for an excuse to escape the suffocating office. The sharp antiseptic smell of the hospital filled the corridors. A doctor met me outside the ICU. When I saw Helen through the glass, I realized that only a shadow remained of the old woman who had come to my home. She was lost in the white sheets. When they let me in, I approached her bed. Her eyes were half open. A faint, pained smile touched her lips when she saw me. I leaned in. It was clear she was struggling to breathe. "She heard," Helen whispered, each word seeming to tear a piece from her lungs. "When Brenda found out Mark was arrested, when the lawyers called the house, she knew I had talked to you." She swallowed hard. A tear slid from her eye onto the pillow. "She went crazy. Mrs. Hayes," she continued. "She was like a woman possessed. You did this. You ruined my life. You turned him in." She screamed at me, sick as I was. She threw me out into the street in the middle of the night. "I don't have a mother like you," she said. "Go die wherever you want." My blood ran cold. For a child to throw her dying mother into the street. The world of lies Mark had created had poisoned Brenda, too, stripping her of her humanity. That woman was so fixated on Mark and their false future that she saw her own mother, the truth teller, as the enemy. Helen tried to lift her trembling hand. I took it. It was ice cold. "Don't be sad," she said, as if seeing the horror on my face. "My job is done. I've laid down my burden. At least I'm not dying as a partner in that lie, carrying the weight of that complicity. That's enough for me. My grandchildren, they won't grow up inside that lie anymore." Her eyes slowly closed. Her chest rose one last time in a deep sigh and then fell. The rhythmic beep of the monitor in the room flatlined into a long high-pitched tone. Helen Miller had paid the price for her great act of courage in the final days of her life by being rejected by her own daughter. But she had saved herself from the swamp. An expression of deep peace, defying all the pain she had endured, settled on her face. When I left the hospital, the cold Chicago night air hit my face. I got in my car but couldn't start it. I rested my forehead on the steering wheel. Helen's words from that day in my living room echoed in my mind. "If I die, who will look after my grandchildren, Ben and Isla?" Mark was in prison. Brenda was an angry woman who had lost her grip enough to abandon her own mother. What was the children's fault in all of this? Their father was a criminal. Their mother had lost her grasp on reality. Were they doomed to be buried under this rubble? To be lost in that dark house? The next morning at the office, I called Arthur into my room. On my desk were the documents I had managed to find regarding Ben and Isla's school enrollment. "Arthur," I said, my voice resolute. "I need you to handle a very sensitive transaction. This will not go through the company books. It will be funded from my personal account." Arthur examined the documents. He paused when he saw the names, then looked at me over his glasses. Evelyn, these are, yes, I said, not letting him finish. They are Mark's children, but they are also Helen's legacy. But Evelyn, that woman Brenda, she would never accept this. She'll cause a scene if she knows you're helping. She will never know, I said. The payments will be made through an anonymous educational foundation under the name of a merit scholarship or educational support fund. You will speak to the school principal personally, but you will not use my name. You'll say it's from a philanthropist. Their tuition, transportation, meals, uniforms, school supplies, everything will be covered until they graduate from college. Arthur leaned back in his chair, stunned. Why, was all he asked. They are the children of the man who did this to you. I stood up and looked out the window at the city. Because justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, Arthur. It's also about protecting the innocent they leave behind. Those children will already grow up knowing their father is a thief and their mother is blind. They shouldn't have to fight poverty and ignorance as well. The only way we can save them from that house, from that mentality, is through education. After a long silence, Arthur nodded, his eyes moist. I'm proud of you, my dear, he said, taking the files and leaving. That day, Ben and Isla's school fees were paid. Brenda probably thought it was a stroke of luck. Maybe some help from one of Mark's old connections. She would never learn the truth. She would never know that the hand paying for their education, saving their future, belonged to the woman her partner had betrayed. This wasn't my revenge. This was my victory. A quiet, unshowy, and honorable victory. The sound of my heels on the cold marble floors of the Cook County Courthouse echoed a rhythm not of escape but of a definitive end. Our lawyer James and my CPA Arthur were waiting for me at the heavy courtroom door. James wore a look of professional gravity. Arthur's gaze held a fatherly pride. Are you ready? Arthur asked quietly. More than I've ever been, I said, the clarity in my voice cutting through the corridor's hush. Months of investigations, expert analyses, and all-night preparations had all led to this moment. When we entered the courtroom, Mark was sitting at the defendant's table between two bailiffs. It was the first time I had seen him since the night of his arrest. The confident man in the impeccable Italian suits who could solve any problem was gone. The jacket he wore seemed too big for his shoulders. His face was gray, the white in his hair more pronounced. He looked up when he saw me. A flicker of hope, perhaps a search for mercy, crossed his eyes, but he was met only with a will of steel in my gaze. The judge reviewed the file one last time. The thick binders on his bench were the bricks of the empire of lies Mark had built. The Apex Shell Company, the fraudulent invoices, the documents forged with my signature, the millions transferred to offshore accounts, it was all there. The forensics report had confirmed unequivocally that the signatures were forgeries. There wasn't a single line of wiggle room left for him to deny or hide. Defendant Mark Hayes, the judge said, his voice echoing in the chamber. Do you have a final statement? Mark stood up, his hands clasped in front of him. I could see his knees shaking from where I sat. I am, he began, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat. I am only sorry. He couldn't say anything else. He couldn't say for my family because all of Chicago now knew which family he had been stealing for. The judge asked us to rise as he prepared to deliver the verdict. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but I did not compromise my posture. The court has reached a verdict, the judge began, the words falling like a heavy silence in the room. He handed down separate sentences for aggravated fraud, forgery, and breach of trust. As the judge listed the years for each charge, Mark's shoulders slumped further as if crushed by an invisible weight. The total sentence meant he would spend the most productive years of his life behind bars. He was also ordered to pay full restitution to the company for all damages with interest. As the bailiffs took his arms, he turned to look at me one last time. There was no longer a plea in his eyes, only absolute defeat. He was paying the price for underestimating me, for seeing a woman only as a wife, while ignoring her identity as a business partner, her intelligence. I didn't watch as he was led out the door. I turned to the judge, bowed my head slightly in a gesture of respect. It was a salute, not to vengeance, but to justice. When we left the courthouse, Chicago's famous biting wind was there to meet us, but the cold felt good, washing away the tension from my face. A few business reporters were waiting. The story had broken, but they didn't get the crying victimized wife headline they were hoping for. Instead, they faced a powerful CEO who had personally handed the man who robbed her company over to justice, managed the crisis, and kept her ship from sinking. James came to my side, smiling as he packed his briefcase. "Congratulations, Miss Hayes," he said. "It was an incredibly difficult process, but you handled it perfectly. As of this morning, the company's stock is on the rise. The market has renewed its confidence in response to your transparency and decisiveness. Everyone is talking about your leadership." "The cleanup is done, James," I said, taking a deep breath. "We've cleaned house." Arthur opened my car door. "What now, my dear? You'll want to rest for a bit, perhaps." I put on my sunglasses and looked toward the horizon of skyscrapers. "No rest, Arthur," I said. "I'm going back to work. I have contracts to sign, a company to grow, and a daughter to raise." As the car pulled away, I watched the courthouse recede in the rearview mirror. That building had swallowed my past, my disappointments, and Mark, but it hadn't swallowed me. On the contrary, it had forged me in steel. I picked up my phone and called my assistant. "Move tomorrow morning's board meeting up," I said in a crisp voice. "And I want all the reports from the finance department on my desk. A new era is beginning." Chicago was watching, I knew. And what they saw was not a broken woman, but a leader rising from the ashes. Justice had been served. Now it was time to continue life, not from where it left off, but from where it should be, stronger than ever. The morning I had the brass nameplate removed from the door of Mark's old office, everyone in the company understood the changes were more than just cosmetic. I had the room completely gutted. The somber leather chairs, the ostentatious mahogany desk, and the heavy velvet curtains that blocked the windows, I had them all thrown out. In their place, I commissioned a modern conference room with glass walls, transparent and filled with light. From now on, there would be no more whispers behind closed doors, no more secret accounts in this company. Everything would be as clear as those glass walls. My weekly review with our new CFO, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, was the most concrete proof of this new order. Sarah was a disciplined, no-nonsense veteran approaching retirement, a woman obsessed with making every cent of the balance sheet line up. The report she placed before me had no gray areas, no question marks. "Miss Hayes," Sarah said, adjusting her glasses, "our cash flow has improved by 20 in the last quarter. After cutting unnecessary expenses and those payments to that other company, we even have a budget for new investments. The debt restructuring is also complete. The banks have removed us from their high-risk client list." "Good," I said, closing the file. "We'll be distributing a portion of that budget as bonuses to the staff. Sarah, I want everyone to know that it's the crew, not just the captain, who saves the ship. Loyalty should be rewarded." A rare appreciative smile appeared on Sarah's face. When she left, I leaned back and took a deep breath. I used to feel a constant unease sitting in this chair, as if something I didn't know, something I couldn't control was always happening. Now that weight was gone from my shoulders. I was now master of every detail. Mark had kept me away from saying, "You wouldn't understand, Evelyn. Finance is complicated. You just be the face of the company." I knew every check I signed, every invoice I approved by heart. I was my father's daughter, but now I was my own woman. In the afternoon, walking down the hall, it was impossible not to notice the change in the employees' expressions. The woman they used to see as the boss's daughter or Mr. Hayes's wife was gone. Now when they looked at me, they saw the steel resolve of the person who didn't let go of the helm in the middle of a storm, who saved the ship from crashing on the rocks. Their greetings were more direct, their tone more respectful. Authority wasn't earned by shouting or banging a fist on a table. It was earned by standing tall in a crisis. I had learned that firsthand. That evening, as I walked out of the revolving doors of the building, I told my driver, "Just drop me at home. You can have the rest of the night off." I wasn't afraid to go home anymore. The lies that had seeped into the walls of that apartment, the silent tensions had been cleansed. When I entered, Lily was on the living room floor drawing with a spread of colored pencils. Seeing me, she jumped up and ran to hug me. She was only 8, but she had felt the tension of the past few months in her little heart. She thought her father was on a long business trip. For now, on the advice of her therapist, we were letting the truth unfold over time, but a child's intuition is strong. She could breathe the lighter air in the home, too. "Welcome home, Mom," she said, burying her face in my neck. "Look what I made at school today." She pulled me over to her drawing. On the paper was a giant sun, a house, and 2 figures holding hands. One was her, the other was me. I didn't ask why she hadn't drawn her father. I didn't try to fill that empty space. "It's wonderful, sweetie," I said, stroking her hair. We went to the kitchen together. I had sent the housekeeper home early. I wanted to be alone with Lily, to chop tomatoes and boil pasta. As I stood at the stove, Lily sat on the counter, swinging her legs and watching me. "Mommy," she said suddenly, her voice bright. "You smile a lot more now." The wooden spoon in my hand paused midair. I turned to her. "Do I?" "Yeah," she said. "Before, when Daddy was here, you always looked tired. You were always looking at your phone. You're still tired now, but your eyes are shiny. And you play more games with me." My eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of happiness. I leaned in and kissed her forehead. "That's because it's just the 2 of us now, and we're a very strong team. We don't need anyone else, Lily." Our dinner wasn't disturbed by the ghost of Mark at the table. The evening meals, once fractured by his phone calls and tense silences under the guise of problems at the office, were now filled with Lily's school stories and our laughter. After putting Lily to bed, I went to my study, but I didn't work. I just looked out at the lights of Chicago. The city was the same, the streets were the same, but I was someone else entirely. I had stepped out of Mark's shadow. I was no longer someone's wife, someone's daughter, or someone's partner. I was Evelyn. And this new Evelyn held the reins of her life so tightly that she would never let anyone take them from her again. It was a morning years later when I first noticed the silver strands in my hair in the mirror. In the afternoon, as the company's hallways buzzed with their usual rhythm, there was a soft knock on my door. Arthur came in. He no longer walked with quick steps, but moved slowly, leaning on a cane for support. Time had stooped his shoulders a bit more, and it had sharpened the focus in my eyes. In his hand was the anonymous blue file he brought me this time every year. He placed it on the corner of my desk, separate from the other corporate reports. "The results are out, Evelyn," he said. His voice was a bit raspy, but it was filled with pride. He took a deep breath as he sat down. "I thought you'd want to see." I lifted the cover of the file. On top was the portrait of a young man. Ben was no longer a child. His features had settled, though the strong line of his jaw resembled his father's. The depth and dignity in his eyes were a clear inheritance from his grandmother, Helen. "University admission results," Arthur said, pointing a finger to a line at the bottom of the page. "College of Engineering, his first choice. Got in with honors." I felt my fingers tremble slightly as I held the paper. In a world where his father had tried to get rich through deceit and shortcuts, his son was succeeding with his own hard work. Ben was a refutation of that dark legacy. I turned the page. This time, a photo of a young girl with a cello appeared. Isla was as graceful as a swan in her black dress. From her recital, Arthur explained. Her instructors say she's a natural prodigy. She's already started receiving invitation letters from conservatories abroad. Looking at the photos, I felt an indescribable lightness in my chest. This was a success more real, more lasting than the biggest deal won or the most profitable contract signed. And his mother? I asked, my eyes still on the photos. Does Brenda suspect anything? Arthur shook his head, a faint, sad smile on his face. No. When she got the letter from the foundation, she was bragging to her neighbors again. Our situation's improved a bit. Their father may be rotting in jail, but things have turned around for the kids. She says she still thinks the money comes from that educational opportunity fund we invented. In fact, she called the foundation last month. My son is starting college, she asked anxiously. The scholarship won't be cut off, will it? The woman is still only concerned with her own livelihood, oblivious to the bigger picture. It's better that she doesn't know, I said, closing the file. If she knew, her pride, the thing she mistakes for dignity, would ruin her children's futures, or worse, she'd turn them against me. They need to grow up without knowing the identity of the hand that's helping them. Arthur leaned on his cane and looked out the window at the gray city skyline. Helen, he said quietly. If she hadn't come to your door that day, who knows where these children would be now? I thought of Helen, the great sacrifice she made in her last days before taking her final breath, by turning in her own daughter's secret. She had given her grandchildren a clean slate. She hadn't just brought news of a betrayal to my home that day. She had entrusted me with the futures of 2 innocent children. This is her work, Arthur, I said. I am merely the vessel. That woman, by tearing one family apart, actually saved these children from the wreckage. Her courage, even years later, illuminates their path. Arthur took the file to take it to the archives. And you honored that trust, my dear. Not everyone would have. People won't even give a glass of water to their enemy's child, and you gave them a life. They are not my enemy, I said, remembering the clear gaze in Ben's photograph. They are the proof of innocence. When Arthur left the room, I didn't go back to work. I sat in silence for a while. The clock on the wall continued to tick, but time was no longer working against me. The wounds of the past had closed, leaving behind a faint ache and a great deal of wisdom. Helen could finally rest in peace. Her will had been done. Justice, in its most silent, invisible, and elegant form, had found its way. Ben would become an engineer. Isla would command stages, and I, from a distance, from the shadows, would watch them and celebrate my quiet victory. After Arthur left, I slowly pushed the drawer shut and locked it. The metallic click closed not just the blue file, but the final accounting in my own conscience. I squeezed the key in my palm, the cold of the metal seeping into my skin. I walked to the window. The Chicago sun was setting, leaving a tired reddish reflection on the glass of the skyscrapers. Years had passed. In this city, people loved to talk, especially about women like me who held power. Some saw what I did to Mark as a merciless act of revenge. Others, without knowing about my secret support for the children, accused me of being hard-hearted. And some perhaps quietly wondered, did she ever forgive him? Forgive? No. Forgiveness requires forgetting. Requires pretending what happened didn't happen. I haven't forgotten. I never forgot Mark stealing my life's work, the world of lies he built while looking me in the eye. But I didn't take revenge either. It wasn't I who sent him to prison. It was his own ambition, his insatiable greed, and his crimes. I simply held the scales of justice. And on the other side of those scales were Ben and Isla. The secret hand I extended to those children was not an act of charity or an atonement for the past. It was simply equity. The sins of the father should not be visited upon the children. If I had abandoned them to those circumstances, to that poverty and their mother's bitterness, what would have been the difference between me and Mark? He had made his children a part of a lie. I, on the other hand, made it possible for them to become individuals standing on their own 2 feet in the light of truth. And in doing so, I learned that the greatest virtue is silence. Goodness is not done with a shout. The door opened. Lily walked in. She was no longer a little girl, but a young woman preparing for her college graduation. Her gaze as determined as mine. Her purse was in her hand, the day's fatigue on her face, but that unextinguishable light was in her eyes. "Mom," she said with a smile. "Are we leaving? Don't want to be late for our dinner reservation." I looked at her. In Mark's absence, she hadn't been diminished. On the contrary, she had become more whole. She knew about her father's mistakes, but she hadn't been poisoned by that knowledge because I had taught her honesty and resilience. "I'm coming, honey," I said. I reached to turn off the lamp on my desk, but my hand paused for a moment in midair. My mind went back one last time to that day, to the afternoon my doorbell rang. Helen in. Her old faded coat with her trembling hands and the rasping breath from her lungs. She was the sole architect of this story, of this company, of Ben's engineering career, of Isla's cello, and of the peace I felt right now. I had protected my father's legacy perhaps, but that woman had saved a future she never had. By risking her own daughter's hatred, by spending her last breath on a confession, she had changed all of our lives. You can run an empire. You can sign multi-million-dollar contracts, but true power is the quiet courage of a mother with nothing left to lose, doing what is right. If she had not knocked on that door that day, none of us would be here now. I put my arm around Lily's shoulder. "Let's go," I said. As we left the office, I glanced back one last time. The lights went out, the doors were locked. What remained was neither anger nor regret, just the deep, quiet peace of having done what had to be done. Perhaps in your life too, a difficult truth has knocked on your door or there is a heavy burden you must carry. Perhaps you are in the middle of a storm. But remember, the greatest changes begin not with noise but with quiet determination. And sometimes to change the world, you don't need armies. All you need is the brave heart of a woman who refuses to be broken.